you. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Kit Fox, and I am the Special Projects Editor for Runner's World Plus. And first off, I just want to thank the Atlanta Track Club for letting Runner's World be a part of this event. Can we give the Atlanta Track Club a round of applause? I think one of the biggest stories of the weekend is kind of just how innovative and awesome they've been in both treating the trials athletes and they just held a high jump competition at their expo, which is really cool. So thank you so much to them. But more importantly, I want to introduce the gentleman to my right here. We have Matt Futterman. Matt is the deputy sports editor for the New York Times, and he is also a writer, and we're here to talk about his latest book. It came out last June called Running to the Edge. So Matt, thanks so much for being here. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here. Love being in Atlanta, and thanks for all the hospitality, Atlanta Track Club.
Yep. Now, I just got done reading the book, and I think one of the things I have to say, and one of the things that would describe you is just one of the world's biggest running fans. And you can just kind of see that joy throughout the book the whole time. And I just kind of want to start by asking you, how did you sort of think about and first realize that Running to the Edge, this book, was a story? And can you just sort of give us a brief synopsis of what the book covers?
Sure. So this book is about a guy named Bob Larson, who I knew, and anyone who does know him probably knew him as Meb Keflezighi's coach. Meb's a pretty decent runner, has pretty good history in this trials race. And so that's how I knew him. And then I got invited in 2015 at the Boston Marathon to a screening of a documentary with him. And it was about Bob, and it was called City Slickers Can't Stay With Me. And it was mostly about Bob and Meb, but in that documentary there was this backstory about Bob's origins with a group of hippie runners from the 1970s called the Hummel Toads. And these were basically his lab rats. And these were the guys that he used to figure out how he would train the world's fastest runners, like Meb Keflezighi and Dina Castor and a slew of other Olympians, especially when he was at UCLA. And I just looked at this picture of these guys with scraggly beards who came out of nowhere to win the 1976 National Cross Country Championships, which was the race that put Bob on the map. And I saw that picture, and I thought, I got to get to know these guys. And I just had a sense that their story and that the passion in their story would be able to tell the story of running that I've always wanted to tell.
Now, I think, one of the amazing things that this book shows is that, in the 1960s, we're talking pre-running boom, these top runners and these coaches, in some ways, really had no idea what they were doing, or there was not much science to back that up. So, Bob Larson becomes this really innovator in the way that he's training his athletes, and also just the culture that he created. So can you talk about what training for top athletes in 1960 and before that was like, and then sort of the innovations that Bob Larson came up with?
Sure, it's a great question. So there was no, the extent that people talk about what the Bible was of training before 1960, there really was no Bible. You had essentially two schools, to say that there were even schools. You had the Eastern Europeans, whose hero was Zatopek, who did these crazy intervals. Zatopek's workouts would be, he's the only guy to win the 5,000, 10,000 in the marathon in the same Olympics. He was Czech. And he used to run 70 quarter miles. That's, completely batshit, to use the scientific term. And so that was his school. And then on the other side of the map, you'd had the Lydiard school, and he was the Kiwi, and he kind of invented the word jogging. And his whole idea was train, don't strain. Lots of long, slow distance. And Larson comes along as basically a college guy at San Diego State who's pretty fast, but oh, there you go. Got some Aztecs. Not a bad basketball team this year, huh? Right? So he comes along, and he has this idea of marrying those two schools. He has really two questions, which is why do the intervals have to be so short, and why do the long runs have to be so slow? And in doing that and playing around with his own running, and then with the high school runners he began coaching in the mid-'60s in East County, San Diego, he really invents what we now all call the tempo run or the threshold run, which is that middle distance, go as hard as you can, go right to your edge, to that point where one click faster is going to be really, really hard to breathe, but one click slower is going to be a little too comfortable, and teach your body how to be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
And I'll mention that, the way that you sort of build these scenes in the book and talk about these workouts, they sound gruesome and painful and mentally just so challenging. And so I think one of the kind of beautiful things, it goes straight into your title, which is running to the edge, and that's exactly kind of his philosophy. But the other kind of innovation that he had that I'm curious sort of why you think he came on this innovation was that you can run to the edge, but it's really difficult to do that by yourself. Just kind of this idea of the solo distance runner, kind of the lonely road of attrition and things like that. He kind of threw that out the window and was really emphasized the fact that you need a team of support around you. So how did he come to that conclusion, and then what was kind of the culture he created around the Humul Toads?
So it is very counterintuitive, because we think about running as, the most solitary endeavor, and like you said, we glorify the loneliness of the long distance runner, and Bob just really believed that the group was more powerful than the individual, and I think he got that from being a runner himself, and just being very competitive and always feeling like he and his teammates were pushing each other, and that when he was doing it alone, he wasn't as strong. And so, there are three basic ideas to Bob's philosophy. One of them we talked about is get yourself comfortable with being uncomfortable. The other is the second one is like who you're born, where you're born, whether you have a sponsor, how much money you have, what logo you have on your shoes, like that is not your destiny. Your destiny is what you make of it. And the third one is never train alone. Because when you are feeling bad and having a bad day and slacking off a little bit, you're going to try extra hard to not get dropped by the group. And then tomorrow, you're going to be feeling really good, and there's going to be some other guy in the group who, if he was alone, would slack off, but he's not going to want to get dropped. And the idea is that every day you go at it with each other and you go to war together, and we run as individuals, but we compete as a team.
Now, the first half of this book is really truly a phenomenal, just like underdog sports story in a way. And
thanks very much. Nice. It's very kind of you to say.
And what's so great about it is, it obviously climax in this wonderful race that's already happened, so I think we can spoil that, where the Humul Toads, this team of literally recent high school grads from this one tiny region in San Diego, take on the big boys from Colorado, Oregon. We're just starting to get shoe sponsorships in the place, and they kind of come out of nowhere. Can you sort of describe just like the attitude and like who the Humul Toads were and what they believed?
The Humul Toads, they so believed in Bob's ideas. These are guys who grew up together, they formed that sort of that brotherhood and sisterhood that we see so many runners forming today, especially so many people who are going to be competing tomorrow, because that's really like what I think tomorrow's race is all about. It's this celebration of these different clubs of runners from all around the country. I don't know that there's anyone at the top level who's competing tomorrow who isn't part of a training group. And when you talk about the Humul Toads, they just believed that they were as good as anybody was because they knew the work that they were putting in. They knew how Bob had trained them. They had seen the results. Most of them had gone to junior colleges, and they would go to these meets, and they were competing against four-year colleges, and sometimes they were in separate races. But they would look up at their times at the end of the meets, and they would see that they were right up there with the best teams in the country. So that's really what they believed in. And Bob had gone to this little company that was existing in Oregon back then and asked them for a little bit of money so that they could get this group from San Diego to Philadelphia for the National Cross Country Championships. And he looked at the roster, the Nike representative, and he said, "Yeah, I don't think you can compete with Colorado." And that was all he needed to hear, and that was all they needed to hear to know that they were going to go out there and put Colorado in their place.
And so when I was reading this, I just wish that the production team behind Netflix's Last Chance U and Cheer were around to sort of document this, because it's very similar. The story, honestly, is very similar. It's this junior college with this one incredibly innovative coach who builds this powerhouse out of just the talent that he has around him.
When I was a kid, there was a movie called Breaking Away. Great cycling movie. The Cutters, right? Mm-hmm. From Bloomington, Indiana, and they take on the Italian racing team. And when I saw that documentary and I started talking to the Hummel Toads, like, I had that film in my head as I was writing it. And so, yes, it's sort of this sort of classic underdog story about what you can do when you really believe in yourself. Mm-hmm. And, you talk about the Toads. I mean, Meb's going to be up here in a couple hours. I mean, Meb talks all about the Toads, and it's and it's his spirit too. This is at the heart of how he felt about himself, and I think that's something that sort of ties together a lot of the runners that Bob cultivated over the years. Is they were not necessarily the sort of blue chip guys. They were guys that instead had the little bit of a chip on their shoulder, and he used that to his advantage, whether it was in the 70s or in the 2000s.
And so another great aspect about this book is that it sort of chronicles the rise, the fall, and the rise again of American distance running, because you have in the 60s, 70s, and up until really like 1984, Americans dominating all these major marathons, and then they just disappear. And can you just sort of talk a little bit about what you think happened with this like American drought in the 90s?
So I think two things happened. The first, and it's sort of a chicken and an egg scenario, but the running shoe companies really sort of took over running, and they became the main funding source rather than the amateur athletic clubs, whether it was New York Athletic Club or Philadelphia Athletic Club, or that we had seen around the country for so many years. In addition to that, what you saw was, money follows medals. And the medals were really going in the shorter distances. And so the shoe companies, they really put a lot of their sponsorship money behind let's say the 800 and down. And Bob was part of this and admits he was part of this because he went to coach at UCLA. And he was chasing national championships. And the way you win college national championships is you get guys who can score. And those are quarter milers. And so he was focused on them for a while as well. But it always frustrated him that we had sort of abandoned the long distance runners. And once those distance runners were abandoned, they didn't have the funding sources. They were sort of left to train on their own. And when they were left to train on their own and there was no group and they didn't have the money, they didn't have support, there's only so much you can do without that support. And now, in addition to that, I do think, and I write about this somewhere in the book, that people really got spooked by what happened to Alberto Salazar. And that here was the most talented runner in the world who just ran into a wall at 26 years old. And nobody trained harder than Alberto. And I think the sense was that, okay, you only have a limited number of steps in your life, as if you're born with only a limited number of beats in your heart, And if you use all those up in training, they're not going to be there for you. And we stopped running as hard. If you talk to people from the 80s and 90s, some really good runners, they were topping out at about 90 miles a week. And that's just not going to get the job done at the highest level of world distance running.
Based on your research, what would you say was kind of the lowest point of American distance running in that time period?
I think there's no question that it was the Sydney Olympics, where there was only one man in the Olympic marathon who qualified, and it was an automatic spot that we got there. And so I think having gone from a situation, and the women did not place that year, so you go from a situation where, 25 years ago, there's no question that, I don't know how you would want to count it up, 3 of the top 5 marathoners in the world, or certainly a plurality of the top 10 were Americans in the late 70s, and we all know who they are. And then 25 years later, you have no one who can run that, who can qualify at that level. And even just the number of Americans who were running, say, even below 215 and 212, it just really fell off the map. And I think the nadir is, if I'm pronouncing that word right, is in 2000.
And to put this in perspective, I like to think about what the vibe must have been like on the afternoon of the American marathon trials, the afternoon before in 2000 versus what we have 2 decades later, and just how much excitement. I mean, we have the largest trials field in American history tomorrow. We have so much talent. So now we really got to talk about Bob Larson's place and really why he is a huge part in sort of this renaissance, this comeback. So 2000 happens. What does Bob Larson do when he sees that, we're really nobodies in terms of on the world stage of distance running?
Well, he's really scared because he knows that he's been named the Olympic distance coach for 2004, and he needs to figure out a way that he's going to get people on his team who can run with the fastest people in the world. And what he basically does is he says, you know what we have to do? We got to get back to what I was doing in the 1970s with the Toads. We're going to do high volume, we're going to do it hard, and we're going to do it together. And there was one other twist in there. We're going to go to altitude as well. Because that had really been, when he was coming of age in the 60s and 70s, the big scientific breakthrough, let's say the 60s, was heart rates and measuring heart rates. And he was doing that with his high school runners because when he was at San Diego State, he worked with a guy named Fred Cash, who was one of the first people, anywhere who was doing studies on cardiovascular fitness for adults. I mean, it's amazing to think about, but the idea in the 50s and through the early part of the 60s was that if you were to push your heart after the age of about 35, you're going to risk a catastrophic cardiac event. And the big, breakthrough was Fred Cash saying, well, I think the heart might be a muscle, like any other muscle, and if you train it, it'll get stronger. And how do we train it? How do we make it more efficient? Well, let's make people run around the track. And he would do these studies, and that's what Bob had learned. And so initially heart rates were a big breakthrough in the 60s. And then in the 90s and 80s and 90s, altitude, the science of altitude really became a thing. And Bob was not the expert in that. And one thing that is great about Bob, and I think it's great about anyone in any walk of life, it's one of the most valuable things you can have, is you know what you don't know. And so Bob knew what he didn't know, and he gave a call to a guy named Joe Vigil, who was in Alamosa, Colorado, and had been studying altitude training for 30 years. And he said, I need you to help me with this. We need to take a bunch of people to altitude and make them strong. And he became his co-coach. and I see Mary Wittenberg and George Hurst of the New York Roadrunners here, and they gave some of the first funding in order to create this Running USA team.
You gotta give a round
and
of
a
applause
bunch,
for
and
that.
really, they sort of led the way, or were part of the first groups that understood that if we don't support a group of American runners, people aren't going to be interested in running our races anymore. They're going to lose interest in this sport. And so it's people in New York, in Atlanta, in Houston who dipped into their bank accounts and supplied vans and supplied, rent money
This
and
is
filled
the-
the refrigerators of these dozen runners who went to Mammoth Lakes with Bob and Joe to train and prepare for the distance races in 2004.
This is the scene in the movie that's the montage style where you cut in to, they're kind of gathering the
It
person.
seems like you have a film career ahead.
Yeah,
of you,
yeah, we
right?
do. Well, we're working on the
You're working
screenplay
on this, right.
as we
Okay.
speak, right?
The rights are
Yeah,
available.
exactly.
If you're interested.
Okay. All right. Let me see what I have in my wallet, and we can get back to you. Okay. And so this team goes up into Mammoth, and one thing that I love about Bob Larson and this team is not only did he help cultivate some of the greatest American marathoners of all time, but really the most beloved. Because you've got Meb and Dina, who are just widely loved. And can you sort of talk about Bob's relationship with them and just like how he was able to, really truly make them just great runners?
Well, I think both Bob and Joe Vigil, I think like I was mentioning before, he saw what they had inside them, and he understood. They understood what was going to motivate these people. I mean, Dina had been a great runner in high school, went to Arkansas and had what I think she would call a frustrating career. She was very good by certainly our standards, but she hadn't won a national. She didn't win the cross country national. She didn't fulfill her goals there, and she thought she was pretty much done with running. And Joe Vigil was her last call, and people had sort of given up on her, and she'd kind of given up on herself. And in the same way, Meb was not, the shiny thing, even though he had won. The National Cross Country Championships as a collegiate runner, he wasn't the star guy for Nike at the time, and that always frustrated them. And I think it was a matter of Bob sort of using that and using them as leaders, but also understanding that they were really great teammates. I mean, that was the thing that Bob really loves more than anybody, and I think Dina really loves it, and I know Meb loves it. They love being part of a team. It's not all about them. It's really about us and what we can do. And they understand how to pull themselves up and how other people pull them along the way.
Now, this sort of, for my last question, because we need to wrap up here, you talked a little bit, and I think there's a line in there about how this story is started and it isn't ended yet because we're still evolving. We're kind of back on the scene, but it's sort of going to culminate tomorrow with the trials. We have over 700 athletes running. It's really a toss-up right now who can make the Olympic team. Can you talk about, or sort of what Bob's effect or legacy is on what we're going to see tomorrow?
So I think his legacy, both in what we see tomorrow and what I see every time I go for a run in Central Park or when I'm traveling in Santa Monica or here in Atlanta, is that 25 years ago, when I'd be running in a city, you'd see lots of people running, but everybody would be running on their own for the most part. And now, if I'm out in Central Park on a Saturday morning, you see these it's just these clumps of runners. And the idea that you run as part of a group is just so embedded into the culture now. Runners are really part of this grand tribe, and within that tribe are all these sort of mini tribes. And that, I think, is really his legacy. And I think what you have these people who are going to compete tomorrow. They're part of the Hoka team, or they were training in Oregon together, or they're in. they all know each other, and they all work together, and I think that's really what the legacy is and what we're going to see. And it makes everybody faster, whether you're in the sort of sub-elite group that just got in with a 2:44.50 in the women's race, or whether you're going for one of those 3 spots. It's really everyone's sort of, in some sense, part of the same culture here.
Well, awesome. We have to wrap up here. The book is called Running to the Edge. It's phenomenal. I finished it this morning. I highly recommend it. You can buy it on Amazon. Matt, thank you so much for joining us here. And thank you all for coming. We are going to have an incredibly exciting race tomorrow. So I just really can't wait. I'm kind of a little giddy to see what happens. So thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course.